Jake was exhausted after a long shift, driving down a remote desert highway late at night. The road stretched out before him, empty and dark. The only sounds were the gentle hum of his car's engine and the occasional buzz of static from the radio. He hadn't seen another car in what felt like hours. The isolation made the night feel even darker and more eerie than usual. As Jake's eyes started to droop with fatigue, he noticed something strange up ahead. At first, he thought his tired mind was playing tricks on him, but as he got closer, he realized it was a person standing by the side of the road. A woman, to be exact. She was wearing a pale dress, her hair disheveled, and her figure looked small and fragile in the vast emptiness of the desert. Jake hesitated. The woman had her thumb out like she was hitchhiking, but what was she doing out here, in the middle of nowhere? It didn't make sense. His gut told him to keep driving, to not get involved, but something about her seemed desperate. Against his better judgment, he slowed the car and pulled over beside her. The woman didn't say anything. She just opened the back door and slid into the seat, her head bowed and her hair hiding her face. The air inside the car immediately felt colder, and Jake shivered despite the warmth of the night outside. He cleared his throat, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that was creeping up his spine. "Where are you headed?" Jake asked, glancing in the rearview mirror. She didn't respond. She just sat there, staring out the window, her face still hidden by her hair. Jake frowned, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. He tried again. "You need a ride somewhere?" The woman remained silent, her head slightly turned toward the window. Her stillness was unsettling, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He wanted to ask her again, but a strange fear took hold of him, making it hard to speak. The atmosphere inside the car was thick with tension. As the car rolled along the empty highway, the temperature inside continued to drop. Jake reached over to adjust the heat, but it was already turned up. His hands felt clammy, and his heart started to race for no apparent reason. He glanced in the rearview mirror once more, and what he saw made his blood run cold. The woman's reflection was blurry, almost like it was out of focus. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, and looked again. But her reflection remained distorted, as if he were looking at her through foggy glass. Panic began to build in Jake's chest. He tried to keep calm, telling himself it was just his exhaustion playing tricks on him. Suddenly, the woman spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Turn here." Jake snapped his head toward her, startled by the sudden sound. She was pointing to a narrow, dirt road that seemed to appear out of nowhere. There were no signs, no lights, nothing to indicate that this road led anywhere. It wasn't on his GPS, and he had never noticed it before. I don't think that's the right way," Jake stammered, his voice shaky. "Turn here," she repeated, her voice cold and emotionless. Against his better judgment, Jake found himself turning the wheel, guiding the car down the narrow road. The trees closed in around them, their branches casting long shadows that danced in the headlights. The deeper they drove into the woods, the more suffocating the darkness became. The woman began to cry softly. Her sobs filled the car, quiet at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced into the mirror again, and this time, he saw her face clearly. Her skin was deathly pale, her eyes dark and sunken, and her mouth twisted into a silent scream. Jake's breath caught in his throat. He slammed on the brakes and turned around to look at her. The backseat was empty. Terrified, Jake floored the gas pedal, speeding back to the highway. His hands shook on the steering wheel, his mind racing with fear. When he finally reached home, he couldn't stop thinking about the woman, her pale face, her empty eyes. A few days later, Jake told his friend about the strange encounter. His friend went pale. "That's the phantom hitchhiker," he said. "People have seen her before. She died in a car accident on that highway years ago. They say she still roams the road, looking for a ride. Jake didn't believe in ghosts before that night, but now, every time he drives that stretch of highway, he can't shake the feeling that she's still out there, waiting for her next ride. Lisa and Mark had been on the road for hours, driving through the vast desert with no sign of civilization in sight. Their road trip had started as a fun adventure, a way to get away from the city and explore the open road. But as the sun set and the night crept in, the desert felt more like a desolate, empty wasteland. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the hum of the car's engine. To make things worse, the gas light on the dashboard had just come on. They hadn't seen a gas station for miles, and their nerves were beginning to fray. Lisa glanced at Mark, trying to hide her worry. "We need to find a gas station soon, or we're going to be stuck out here." Mark nodded, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. "There's got to be one up ahead. We can't be this far out without running into something." As they continued driving, the desert stretched on endlessly, and their anxiety grew. Finally, after what felt like hours, they saw a flicker of light in the distance. A neon sign, barely visible in the darkness, appeared on the horizon. As they got closer, they realized it was a gas station, a rundown, old place that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But at this point, they didn't care. It was their only option. Mark pulled into the station, and they both breathed a sigh of relief. The gas pumps were rusty, the lights dim, but it was still a gas station. Lisa decided to go inside to see if they could get directions, while Mark stayed outside to fill the tank. As she stepped out of the car, the night air felt cold, unusually cold for a desert night. Lisa walked toward the convenience store, her shoes crunching on the gravel. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, and a small bell above the door jingled, echoing in the quiet night. Inside, the air was thick with dust. The shelves were lined with old, outdated products, cans with faded labels, magazines from years ago. It was like stepping into a time capsule. Behind the counter sat an old man, his skin pale and his eyes hollow. He didn't look up when she entered, didn't even acknowledge her presence. Lisa felt a strange chill run down her spine. She approached the counter cautiously. "Excuse me, do you know how far it is to the nearest town?" The man didn't respond. He just sat there, staring blankly ahead. Lisa frowned and tried again. "Sir, we're low on gas, and we need to find the nearest town." Still, nothing. The man remained completely still, as if he hadn't heard her at all. Lisa glanced around the store, feeling increasingly uneasy. That's when she noticed something odd. A photograph on the wall behind the counter. It was a black and white picture of the gas station from what looked like the 1970s. In the picture, the same old man sat behind the counter, looking exactly as he did now. Lisa's heart raced. She quickly turned and walked out of the store, her pulse pounding in her ears. As she stepped outside, she looked around, but something was wrong. Mark and the car were gone. The gas station itself was gone. She stood alone in the middle of the desert, the cold wind whipping around her. She screamed for Mark, but there was no response. There was no sign of the station she had just been inside. It was as if the gas station had never existed. Danny and Ryan were best friends who loved road trips. They were always seeking new adventures, finding hidden roads, and exploring areas that weren't on the map. This trip was no different. They had planned a route through the countryside, but after a few wrong turns, they found themselves deep in a forest on a narrow, winding road. The sun had set, and the forest around them grew darker with each passing minute. The road was barely wide enough for their car, and the trees seemed to close in on them. The GPS had lost its signal miles ago, and the feeling of being lost was starting to creep in. Maybe we should turn around, Ryan suggested, glancing nervously at the dense woods. Danny shook his head. Nah, we'll find our way out. It's just a shortcut. But the further they drove, the more the road twisted and turned, with no end in sight. The air felt thick, and the silence was deafening. Suddenly, a small cabin appeared ahead of them, its dim light flickering through the trees. It looked old, abandoned even, but it was the first sign of civilization they had seen in hours. We should stop and ask for directions, Danny said, pulling the car to a stop. Ryan didn't like the idea, but they had no other choice. They got out of the car and walked toward the cabin. The front door creaked open as they approached, as if it had been waiting for them. Inside, the cabin was cold and damp, filled with dusty furniture and old, tattered curtains. It looked like no one had lived there for years. "Hello?" Danny called out, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. There was no response, but then they heard it, the sound of footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps that made the wooden floorboards creak. Danny and Ryan exchanged uneasy glances. "Let's just leave," Ryan whispered, his voice trembling. But Danny wasn't ready to give up yet. He noticed a photograph on the wall, a black and white picture of two young boys standing in front of a car. The boys looked eerily similar to him and Ryan, down to their clothes and their expressions. A chill ran down his spine. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The house was silent again, but the tension in the air was palpable. Without saying another word, Danny and Ryan bolted out of the cabin and ran back to the car. They jumped in and sped down the road, not daring to look back. As they drove, the forest seemed to stretch on forever, but eventually, they made it back to the main road. They pulled over to catch their breath, both shaken by the strange encounter. That's when they checked their phones and realized something was horribly wrong. Their phones were filled with missed calls and text messages from worried friends and family. They had been gone for 2 days, even though it had only felt like a few hours. The forest, the cabin, everything. They couldn't explain it. To this day, Danny and Ryan still don't know what happened during those missing 2 days, and they've never gone back to that part of the forest.